we're diving into something called the Indian Knowledge System, or IKS for short. Now, this is a vast ancient ocean of wisdom, and it's making some pretty big waves in our modern world. So, what exactly is it? And maybe more importantly, how are we supposed to think about it today?
Right at the heart of this whole conversation is one big question. Is the Indian knowledge system a timeless idea, a flexible way of seeing the world, something that's open to interpretation? Or is it turning into a modern ideology, a rigid set of beliefs with a pretty specific, maybe even political agenda? That's the real tension here, and that's what we're going to unpack together.
All right, so here's our game plan. First, we'll figure out what IKKS actually is. Then, we'll get into its core language and how it's all structured. After that, we'll see how this wisdom was kept safe for thousands of years. And finally, we'll bring it all back to the big debates happening right now.
Okay, let's jump right in. First things first, what is the Indian knowledge system? Well, its traditional name is Bharatiya Jana Parampara. And let's be clear, this is not one single book or some rigid doctrine. Think of it more like a huge interconnected web of knowledge. I mean, we're talking about the tradition that gave us the concept of zero, the foundations of Ayurvedic medicine, and incredibly complex models of the cosmos. It's all connected.
And at its core, the whole system really stands on three pillars. You've got Jnana, which is pure knowledge. Then there's Vijnana. That's the scientific, empirical side of things. And finally, Jivana Darshana, which is basically the philosophy of how to live a good life. So right from the start, you can see this wasn't just about facts. It was about blending science with wisdom. And that blend is what makes it such a powerful framework of ideas. Now, to really get inside this worldview, you gotta know the language. And these aren't just words. They're the building blocks, the core concepts that shape the entire system. First up, a big one, Dharma. It gets translated as duty, but it's so much more than that. Think of it as your own personal moral compass, the right way of living that guides your choices. It's meant to be a personal framework, an idea to live by. Though, of course, some might try to turn it into a rigid, ideological rulebook.
And that connects perfectly to our next word, sanatana. It means eternal. The point here is that these core principles, like Dharma, are seen as timeless and universal. They weren't invented by one person at one point in time. They're presented as truths that are always there. Then you've got the engine that drives everything, karma. This is a word you've definitely heard, and at its core, it's the universal law of cause and effect. It's simple, really. Every single thing you do, say, or even think has a consequence that shapes your life. So where is all this heading? What's the ultimate goal? It's moksha. This is liberation from what's called samsara, the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. And you don't get there by acquiring more stuff. You get there by truly understanding who you are. It's the ultimate destination on this journey of ideas.
Okay, we've got the core concepts down. But how was all this incredible knowledge actually organized and studied? Well, that brings us to the science of Shastra. Now, you might hear the word Shastra and think it just means book or scripture, but it's way more than that. The word itself points to a systematic, disciplined, almost scientific method for studying a topic. And this focus on how you learn is so important because it frames IKS as a system for inquiry, an idea, not just a pile of dusty old beliefs. And this is where it gets really fascinating. The system actually classifies its own knowledge into two types. On one hand, you have Shruti, which means that which is heard. This is considered divine, timeless knowledge, like the Vedas. But then you have Smriti, that which is remembered. These are texts written by human sages, like the epic Mahabharata, and they are meant to be interpreted, debated, and adapted over time. This built-in flexibility is absolutely key to how IKS has survived as a living idea.
So, how did you actually learn this stuff? Well, it was a pretty rigorous process, and it definitely wasn't about blind faith. It started with Shravana, just listening, carefully and attentively. Then came Manana. This is critical reflection, questioning, and thinking it through until you've cleared up every doubt. And only then came Nididhyasana, where that knowledge truly sinks in and becomes a part of who you are. This deep emphasis on critical thinking is pretty much the exact opposite of a rigid ideology.
And this critical thinking wasn't some quiet solo activity either. They took it public. There was a whole tradition of Shastrarth, which were these formal, intense public debates. Scholars would get up and argue their points, constantly testing and refining the ideas within the system to make sure they never turned into stale dogma.
So you have this incredibly rich tradition that's creating this massive body of knowledge over thousands of years. But that brings up a huge question. We're talking about a time way before printing presses, let alone digital files. So how on earth did they physically save any of it? The answer is pretty amazing. It's the art of manuscriptology. No, seriously, just stop and think about that for a second. How do you keep an entire intellectual tradition alive for 3 millennia when your main storage device is basically a leaf? It takes a kind of cultural commitment that's just mind-boggling. For centuries upon centuries, knowledge wasn't printed. It was painstakingly etched onto materials from nature. We're talking about things like Bhojpatra, which is birch bark, and Tadpatra, which are specially treated palm leaves. Every single one is this incredibly delicate vessel carrying a piece of history. And the ways they protected these manuscripts, it's like a set of ancient life hacks for librarians. They used all-natural insect repellents like turmeric and lemongrass oil, wrapped them in special cloth, and carefully controlled their exposure to light and humidity. This wasn't just about storing objects. It was about protecting a living idea, something precious enough to pass down through generations. And believe it or not, that tradition of preservation is still going strong, just with a modern twist. India's National Mission for Manuscripts is in the middle of this massive project to digitize millions of these texts. On one hand, this makes the knowledge accessible to everyone, everywhere, reinforcing it as a global idea. But it also raises new questions about who gets to control this heritage, which brings us right back to that risk of it being captured by an ideology. Which, of course, brings us full circle, right back to today. Now that we have a better handle on what IKS is, how it works, and how it was preserved, we can finally take on that question we started with. In our world, right now, is it an idea or an ideology? And nowhere is this debate hotter than in the field of education. You have one camp that says bringing IKS into schools is a vital act of decolonization, a way to reconnect with indigenous knowledge and revive these powerful ideas. But then you have another camp that's really worried about indoctrination. They fear it could be twisted into a nationalistic ideology that might even push pseudoscience. And really, that's what this all boils down to. It's a massive challenge. How you take this ancient, holistic way of thinking and integrate it into a modern world that demands hard scientific proof. The trick is to draw on its incredible wisdom without letting it get squeezed into a rigid political box. So, I'll leave you with this final thought, and it's a question that applies to way more than just the Indian knowledge system. How can we let ancient wisdom help guide our future without allowing it to be hijacked and distorted by the often messy agendas of the present? It's something worth thinking about.